Plato's Ion, the Rhapsode's Dilemma, and the Philosophy of Inspiration. The Archē of Encounter, why the Ion commands first place. As we discussed in episode 1, to engage the Platonic corpus as a dynamic philosophical journey, we must look beyond the traditional arrangement by Thrasyllus of Mendes, the 1st century AD editor. Thrasyllus grouped Plato's dialogues into 9 tetralogies, situating the Ion in the 7th along Hippias Major, Hippias Minor, and Menexenus. A tetralogy is a cluster of works into a group of 4. In Thrasyllus' opinion, Ion belonged in the 7th tetralogy because he categorized it alongside works that scrutinize those who profess professional wisdom. This traditional placement, though not arbitrary, obscures the dialogue's true role. For the reader seeking the genesis of Plato's philosophy, the Ion demands precedence even before the Apology or Credo. Here, in this concise early work, Plato stages the foundational crisis from which all subsequent philosophy unfolds. The confrontation is between rational, accountable knowledge and the mysterious, irrational force of divine inspiration. The central question is whether excellence is a knowledge one can possess, teach, and defend, or a divine force that seizes and leaves reason behind. This tension reflects the broader cultural landscape Plato navigated. Where Homer remained the undisputed educator of Greece, providing a source for everything from military strategy to healing. The Ion is the Archē, the primal scene where philosophy first distinguishes its own rational account-giving from the beautiful, uncomprehending power of Mania. Until this crisis is understood, we cannot comprehend the later Socratic demands for definitions, the banishment of the poets in the Republic, or the rehabilitation of madness in the Phaedrus. Plato diagnosed what we might now call the Dunning-Kruger effect. The man who knows so little, he cannot recognize the boundaries of his own ignorance. This investigation into the limits of Techne, rational craft versus mania, divine madness, this is not merely a historical curiosity. It maps a permanent structure of the human soul that recurs wherever logos is overwhelmed by pathos, and accountability dissolves into spectacle. Superficially, the Ion presents itself as a concise and almost light-hearted vignette, punctuated by Socratic irony and the playful deflation of Rhapsode's vanity. Yet when we navigate the temporal distance to view the spiritual exhaustion of post-war Athens and the shadow cast by the execution of Socrates, which was, Plato's master and beloved guide, and when we contemplate the historical wreckage wrought by those who claimed divine authority to plunder civilizations, this dialogue reveals a far more sinister architecture. It is no longer a mere comedic encounter between a philosopher and a vessel of the muses. This becomes an investigation into the primal credentials of truth and power and morality. This recognition alters the soul of the inquiry, and it becomes a lot darker than you think. And yet we still live amongst this Platonic mania. Let me really flesh this out so you can easily get inside of what I think Ion is actually offering us. Okay, picture a man in oil-stained California. The year is 1902. He stands before a congregation in a modest church. His eyes are wild with conviction, his voice trembling with the authority of one who claims direct access to the divine. He speaks of holy fire, of God's plans, and all the powers unseen. The parishioners weep. Their hair stands on end. Their hearts pound with the certainty that they're in the presence of something sacred. But when the oilman enters this tent, Daniel Plainview, that ruthless embodiment of American pragmatism, he does not weep. He watches. He listens. And he discovers what the philosopher always discovers when confronted by the performer. The preacher cannot produce what he promises. He can move the crowd, but he cannot move the earth. He can summon tears, but he cannot summon oil. He is, in the end, a rhapsode of the American frontier. An Ion in a linen suit, crowned not with a golden wreath from the Homerids, but with a desperate faith of those who need to believe that beauty and knowledge are the same thing. Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood understood what Plato understood, that the man who performs divine power and the man who possesses it are separated by an abyss that no amount of charisma can bridge. When Eli Sunday finally admits in that bowling alley that he is nothing, that he has no money, no authority, no genuine power, he is reenacting the final scene of Plato's Ion 24 centuries later, choosing between being called unjust and being called nothing at all, and discovering that the divine he claimed was merely the echo of his own vanity. Now, in all honesty, comparing Plato's Ion to There Will Be Blood is kind of like comparing a water pistol, a water gun to a shotgun. They're the same thing, but they're totally different. They're totally different species. Even though they both, I guess, in a sense, they both validate each other. But I don't want to give any spoilers away. But There Will Be Blood. The title of the movie is, the title suits it well, I guess you could say. Let's turn our attention to the television screens of the late 20th century. How about to the stadiums filled with the faithful, to the men in $1,000 suits who wept on cue, who spoke in tongues, who laid hands upon the sick and promised miracles in exchange for donations? Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, the entire carnival of televised sanctity. These were not aberrations of American religion, but the logical fulfillment of the rhapsodic profession. They were like Ion, but with microphones in front of millions of people. They could make the audience weep, and they could make hearts pound, and they could hold all of these people spellbound with recitations of scripture more beautifully than anyone else. But ask one for charity, or ask them to explain the theology they traded in. Ask them to give an account of the healing they promised. Ask them to practice the generalship of the soul they so confidently directed. And the performances collapse into the same forced choice that Socrates presented to the rhapsode of Ephesus. Either you are unjust, possessing knowledge but refusing to share it, or you are divine, speaking beautifully without knowledge. They chose the divine as Ion did, And their congregations, like the Athenian audience, chose the ring over the stone, that transmitted passion over the source. Now, consider the present hour, where the crisis has metastasized beyond the tent and the television studio into the very architecture of knowledge itself. We are witnessing what Sam Harris has called the death of the professional, the systematic collapse of credential, expertise, and accountable craft before the onslaught of charismatic ignorance. The health influencer with 2 million followers who has never studied immunology, but who discourses on vaccines more beautifully than any physician. The political commentator who has never governed, but who knows what a general would say to his soldiers. The wellness guru who has never healed, but whose eyes fill with tears when describing the posits of alternative medicine. These are not merely modern annoyances. They are the direct descendants of Ion of Ephesus, professional interpreters of a tradition they do not understand, conduits of passion without comprehension, suspended rings in a chain that begins nowhere and ends in the human nervous system. When Socrates asked the rhapsode whether he could explain Homer's medical passages better than a physician, he was asking the ancient equivalent of whether an influencer's tears constitute clinical evidence. When he demanded to know why Ion did not serve as a general if he knew generalship, he was exposing the same gap that now separates the podcaster's confidence and the practitioner's silence. Plato's intolerance for this condition was, I don't think it was personal. It seems it was more structural, almost like a geological in its ferocity. He recognized that when thought becomes an art instead of order, when knowledge is replaced by aesthetic effect, the polis is poisoned at its root. The rhapsode does not merely entertain, he also educates. He does not merely recite, he is seen as interpreting. He stands at the center of the culture apparatus and claims authority over charioteering, medicine, prophecy, and war, while possessing none of these crafts. His tears are real. His heartbeat is genuine. His hair truly does stand on end. But these are symptoms of possession, not proof of understanding. Plato diagnosed what we know now called the Dunning-Kruger effect in its original theatrical form. The man who knows so little that he cannot recognize the boundaries of his ignorance, and who therefore mistakes his own emotional transport for expertise. The Ion is not a dialogue about poetry. It is a dialogue about the first credential crisis in Western civilization. The moment when a culture realized that its most prestigious educational institution, the recitation of Homer at great festivals, might be nothing more than a beautiful fraud. And fraud is not too strong a word, though it requires careful handling. Ion is not a villain. He is a professional. He's a competitor, a man who has devoted his life to his craft and who believes with perfect sincerity that his craft is knowledge. He has won first prize at Phaedrus. He hopes to win at the Panathenea. He deserves, he thinks, a golden wreath from the Homerids themselves. He is the best in his field, and his field is the interpretation of the most important texts in Greek civilization. If we cannot call him a fraud without qualification, It is because the system that crowned him is itself the accomplice. The festival of Escapulus, the Panathenaea, the entire Pan-Hellenic circuit, these were not mere entertainment venues. They were the universities of their age, the TED Talks of ancient Greece, the institutions where cultural authority was manufactured and distributed. To win at Epidurus was to be certified as a teacher of Greece, and Socrates, standing in the Athenian street outside this system, asked the question that no one inside the tent dares to ask. So, what do you actually know? The answer, as we shall see, is nothing. Or rather, the answer is that Ion knows how to be moved and how to move others, but he does not know why. He is a conduit, not a source. He's a ring on the magnet. He's not the magnet itself. And in that recognition lies the philosophy's most enduring hostility. It's toward every form of unearned authority. What follows is the exegesis of that recognition, the anatomy of a deception so ancient and so persistent that it has outlived every technology of transmission. The rhapsode's staff to the televangelist's microphone to the influencer's ring light. We begin in Athens in the 390s BC, where a young Plato, still reeling from the execution of his teacher, turns the Socratic method upon the cultural apparatus that has made Socrates' death possible. The rhapsode must be examined, not because he is wicked, but because he is dangerous. He is dangerous precisely because he is beautiful. And beauty without account is the oldest weapon in the war against thought. Athens in the 390s BC, the writing moment. Plato composed the Ion in the 390s BC, before that perilous decade after the Peloponnesian War, when Athens lay exhausted, humiliated, and spiritually disorientated. The long wall surrounding Athens had been dismantled, the empire shattered, the democracy restored but trembling. Socrates has been executed in 399 BC, and the young Plato, still under the spell of his teacher's death, was writing the early dialogues that preserved the Socratic elegies in the most vigorous form. Socratic elegies, that's the Socratic method, the refutation. I'll say this a couple times just to keep us on par with that. The intellectual atmosphere of the 390s was saturated with what literary critic Harold Bloom would later name the anxiety of influence. Homer remained the undisputed educator of Greece, the source from which generals learned strategy, physicians learned healing, and statesmen learned persuasion. Against this cultural dominion, the sophists had mounted their commercial challenge, offering to teach arete, the quality of being a good human being. They taught for a fee, claiming that Homeric expertise could be reduced to transferable technique. Into this contested space, Plato inserted the figure of Ion, a professional rhapsode who embodies both the old faith in poetry and the new faith in professionalized skill. The dialogue is therefore not a detached aesthetic treatise. It is a political and epistemological intervention, written at the precise moment when Athens needed to rebuild not merely its walls, but its understanding of what knowledge is. Richard Kraut, in his magisterial opening to the Cambridge Companion to Plato, situates these early works in a period when Plato still wears the Socratic mask, probing moral terms while the historical Socrates had limited himself to the question of how one should live. Yet in the Ion, that same Socratic method turns outward against the cultural apparatus itself, testing whether the most powerful educational institution in Greece can survive rational examination. Athens before 412 BC, the dramatic moment in the shadow of Sicily. The dialogue is dramatically set before 412 BC, a date that carries lethal significance for understanding its argument. In 413 BC, Athens had suffered the catastrophic defeat of the Sicilian expedition, losing thousands of citizens, dozens of ships, and a generation of military commanders. The city was hemorrhaging generals. In the desperate years that followed, Athens began hiring foreign mercenary commanders and appointing non-citizens to positions of military leadership that would have been unthinkable in the Periclean age. This historical context transforms what appears to be a philosophical joke into a deadly serious political provocation. When Socrates suggests to Ion, a foreigner from Ephesus, that he ought to serve as an Athenian general rather than wander Greece reciting poetry, the suggestion is not the non sequitur it seems. Socrates is pressing Ion against the grain of actual military policy. Athens needed generals. Foreigners were being appointed. If Ion truly possessed the knowledge of generalship, his refusal to serve was not merely a personal choice, but a dereliction in time of civic emergency. The dramatic date thus intensifies the elenchus. The rhapsode who claims to know what a general should say to his soldiers is confronted not with abstract logic, but with the historical reality that his supposed knowledge is urgently needed and conspicuously absent. So I'm still like layering on the context here, okay, for when we go through the text itself. You're going to hear some of what I'm saying now, repeated as insight in the text, of course, but I just want to fully embrace all of the context that you can, possibly absorb before we get into the text, or, for yourself when you do if you do the reading yourself as well. So I want to turn now to the festival circuit, Epidaurus and the Panathenaea. So in the story, when we're first placed there and we, reading Socrates and Ion having their conversation, Ion has just returned from the festival of Asclepius at Epidaurus, where he has taken first prize in the rhapsodic competition. The setting is not incidental. Epidaurus was one of the great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, a site of healing and competition where Greeks gathered not merely to watch performances, but to participate in a collective, religious, and cultural renewal. This is so important to know this, right, as we read the text. Like this kind of historical information is going to situate us, bring the gravity in of the situation. The Asclepius festival drew competitors from across the Greek world, and to win, there was to achieve recognition as the supreme interpreter of the culture's foundational texts. Ion wears his victory with the pride of an athlete, and indeed, the agnostic structure of Greek festival culture treated poetic performance as a sport, complete with judges, prizes, and civic prestige. Socrates meets him in Athens just before the Pantheia, an even more prestigious festival where the great epics of Homer were ritually recited before the assembled citizenry. The Pantheia was not, it was entertainment, but it was not entertainment. It was constitutional. The recitation of Homer was woven into the civic calendar as a form of collective education, a rehearsal of shared values and martial identity. To be the rhapsode who performed at the Pantheia was to occupy a pedagogical office comparable to that of a lawgiver. Ion's hope to compete there and his confidence that he deserves a golden wreath with the Homerids themselves, this reveals the extraordinary status that the rhapsodes commanded in the cultural economy of the 5th century Greece. The text mentions the Homerids in passing, but their significance demands precise exposition. The Homerids were not merely performers or reciters of Homeric poetry. They were a family or like a guild claiming direct descent from Homer himself. Institutional lineage that preserved, transmitted, and performed the epics across generations. Their authority was genealogical as well as artistic. To receive a wreath from the Homerids was to be recognized by the living descendants of the tradition's originator, a certification of authenticity that carried weight across the Greek world. This institutional context sharpens Ion's boast. When he declares that he deserves a golden wreath from the Homerids, he is not merely expressing personal vanity. He is claiming recognition from the custodians of the culture's most sacred texts. The rhapsode's profession was therefore embedded in a work of kinship, competition, and religious duty that made his claim to expertise a claim to cultural stewardship itself. So we're talking about this rhapsode. So what were the rhapsodes back then? Rhapsode, celebrity, body, and cultural authority. To understand the force of Plato's intervention, we must recover the social reality of the rhapsode's profession. Rhapsodes were not mere reciters, nor were they the ancient equivalent of audiobook narrators. They were celebrities, competitors, and cultural authorities who traveled from festival to festival wearing elaborate costumes, crowned with wreaths, and accompanied by reputations that preceded them across the Aegean Sea. Their art combined interpretation with embodiment. A rhapsode did not merely read Homer's verses, he enacted them, becoming Hector in one moment and Priam in the next, modulating his voice, his posture, his breathing to match the emotional register of the scene. The rhapsode was, in effect, the first method actor of Western civilization, and his body was the medium through the epic tradition lived. When Ion describes his own physiological responses during performance, his eyes filling with tears, his hair standing on end, his heart pounding at terrifying passages, he is not offering metaphorical descriptions. He is reporting the somatic reality of mimetic identification, the absorption of the performer into the performed. The audience, in turn, experienced this identification at second hand, weeping and trembling, not because of their own sorrows, but because the rhapsode's body had become a conduit for transmitted passion. This was the technology of cultural transmission before writing became dominant. And the rhapsode stood at its center as both priest and performer, interpreter and instrument. The Ion has generated a rich scholarly conversation that will guide our exegesis. Charles Kahn, in his magisterial study of Plato's early dialogues, argues that the Ion is not merely an entertaining skit about a conceited rhapsode, but it's a serious contribution to Platonic epistemology and philosophical psychology, anticipating the theory of divine madness in the Phaedrus, while remaining firmly within the epistemological framework of the early works. Penelope Murray's edition, with its extensive introduction and notes, remains the standard English language resource, situating the dialogue at the heart of ancient debates about poetry and inspiration. Barron's commentary provides a detailed linguistic and philosophical analysis, paying particular attention to the dialogue's argumentative structure and its use of analogy. Ruby Blondell's study of characterization in Plato includes a perspective reading of Ion as the type of artist whose self-understanding is systematically dismantled by Socratic questioning. Francisco Gonzalez argues that the dialogue is not a rejection of poetry, but a challenge to poets to develop a genuine techne of interpretation, a challenge that remains unmet. David Ruchnick emphasizes the dialogue's contribution to Plato's ongoing investigation of the limits of techne, while Carlotta Cappuccino illuminates the Greek terminology of interpretation that Plato reweighs for his own purposes. Elizabeth Asmus, in the Cambridge Companion, shows how the Ion extends the Apology's verdict on poets to the performer and the audience alike. To this scholarly counsel, we add an inference drawn by Aristotle's Metaphysics. And let me just find that citation. At 98.1a12 to 15, Aristotle distinguishes experience from art, noting that those with experience may succeed without knowing why, while the master of an art can teach because he understands the cause. The terms of this distinction resonate so precisely with Plato's opposition between the rhapsode's selective performance and the expert's universal knowledge that one infers Aristotle had the Ion in mind. Even though he does not name the dialogue explicitly, the inference is not certain, but it is compelling. Aristotle seems to have recognized in Plato's earliest interrogation of poetry the seed of his own distinction between empirical knack and rational science. Street in Athens, Socrates and Ion, 530a to 531e. So we're now inside of the text. Socrates meets Ion in the street, fresh from Epidurus, crowned with victory, flushed with success. The philosopher opens with what sounds like simple congratulations, but the irony is immediate and palpable. Socrates professes envy for the rhapsode's beautiful dress, his physical appearance, and his professional necessity to understand the poet's thought, and not merely his words. This opening is saturated with Socratic irony. The admiration of the costume is a gentle mockery of a profession that values external display. The claim that the rhapsode must understand the poet's thought sets the trap that will spring shut across the next 12 Stephanus pages. Ion responds with unguarded vanity. He has won first prize at the Asclepius Festival, and he believes his discourses on Homer more beautifully than anyone else. He deserves, he implies, a golden wreath from the Homerids themselves. The rhapsode is not merely confident. He is convinced that his power is commensurate with knowledge, and his ability to move audiences is identical with his ability to understand what he performs. And the conundrum of selectivity, and we'll find this theme going through 532a to 533c. Socrates tightens the noose with his first question, the question that exposes the fatal crack in Ion's self-understanding. Are you an expert only on Homer, or on Hesiod and Archilochus too? Ion's reply is instantaneous and unembarrassed. Not at all, Socrates, he says. Only Homer. Only on Homer. When other poets are discussed, he says he dozes off. When Homer is named, he wakes up instantly. Socrates presses the logical consequence. If poetry is one thing, like one whole, and if expertise is a domain in one universal within that domain, then the expert should be able to judge all practitioners. The arithmetician recognizes both the good and the bad speaker of numbers. The physician judges every claim about healthy food, not merely those made by one dietary theorist. The same expert applies to all instances of the same subject matter. Therefore, if Ion possessed a techne of poetry, he would understand all poets, not merely one. His selective genius cannot be knowledge. It fails the universality test that defines every genuine craft. Ion admits he has never encountered a rhapsode who could speak beautifully about all poets. The concept of techne is now rigorously defined in the argument. It is holistic, teachable, transferable, and grounded in knowledge of the subject itself. Its role in the dialogue is to expose Ion's claim as illusory. When he confesses that he dozes off at other poets but wakes for Homer, Socrates draws the conclusion that your speaking well about Homer is not a skill you possess, but a divine power that moves you. The magnet and the chain between 533D and 535E. At this hinge, the alternative to skill enters, and it enters through one of the most famous images in Western aesthetics. Socrates introduces the Heraclean stone, the magnet that Euripides had named in a lost play, and transforms it into a cosmic genealogy of artistic transmission. The stone itself not only attracts rings of iron, but imparts power to them so that they in turn attract other rings, creating a very long chain of suspended rings, all hanging by the power derived from that single stone. So too, the muse inspires the poet inspires the rhapsode inspires the audience. The power is transmitted, not possessed, borrowed, not owned. The poets themselves are not in their right minds when they compose. They are light, winged, and sacred, unable to compose until they have been inspired and are out of their sane mind, with reason no longer present within. The god takes away their reason so that we who hear may know that the words are not human, but divine. Lyric poets fly like bees, gathering melodies from the honey springs of the muses, gardens. Each poet is good only in the genre the god impels, bad at all else. The illustrative proof is Tenacious of Chalcis, the least of poets, who composed one perfect hymn to the muses and nothing else of note. The god deliberately chose the weakest vessel to demonstrate that beautiful compositions are not human productions, but divine compositions of gods. The poets are nothing more than the gods' interpreters, possessed by one or other of the gods. The rhapsode, hanging third in the chain, is the interpreter of the interpreters. The body possessed, the tears, hair, and heart. Now we're in section 535B to 536D. So in this section, the argument turns inward towards Ion's own performance. And here the dialogue achieves its most penetrating phenomenological observation. Ion admits that when he recites pietous passages, his eyes fill with tears. At frightening ones, the hairs of his head stand on the end from fear, and his heart pounds. Yet he stands before a friendly audience, crowned in gold, and he's in no real danger. Socrates asks whether we are to say that a person is sane of mind who weeps at imaginary sorrows or fears imaginary dangers while his own adornments are under no threat. Ion admits that he is not in his right mind when he performs. The spectators, too, are the last rings in the chain. Drawn by the same divine power, the intermediate ring is the rhapsode himself, and the god draws the soul of humans to wherever he wishes. This bodily testimony is not mere metaphor. It is Plato's first sustained phenomenology of theatrical absorption. The recognition that the performer who becomes Achilles or Hector undergoes a genuine physiological transformation. The rhapsode's art is embodied. It passes through the nervous system, the circulatory system, the autonomic responses of the performer before it ever reaches the audience. Yet these very symptoms, which Ion offers as proof of his mastery, prove instead his possession. A sane man does not weep at imaginary sorrows. The rhapsode who moments earlier demanded a golden crown is now revealed as a man in the grip of a force he cannot command. The specialist parade, from charioteer to fisherman. This will be 536, 536E through 538B. Socrates returns to the content of Homer's poetry with a new urgency, conducting a systematic reduction of the rhapsode's claim to expertise. If Homer describes chariot racing, who better to judge the correctness of the description? The rhapsode or the charioteer? Ion admits, of course, the charioteer. If Homer describes a medical posit, who better to judge, the rhapsode or the physician? Ion admits, the physician. If Homer describes prophecy, who better to judge, the rhapsode or the prophet? Ion admits, the prophet. Passage by passage, Socrates demonstrates that Homer's poetry covers many subjects, each of which falls under a different specialized skill. But the parade does not stop at prestigious arts. Socrates presses further into the humble crafts. When Homer describes fishing, the lead weight on a line, the rhapsode is not the better judge. The fisherman is. This example is crucial because it completes the spectrum. The principle applies universally, from the highest forms of human expertise to the most modest. There is no domain of Homeric discourse that belongs proprietary to the rhapsode. The rhapsode has no subject matter of his own. He is left with nothing to know. The protean metaphor, becoming other, 538 to 541. Yet Ion attempts one last desperate defense. He claims to know what is appropriate for a man to say, or for a woman, or for a slave, or for a free man, or for a subject, or for someone in charge. Socrates tests this claim with examples. A steersman knows what is appropriate for a ship's captain to say in a storm. A physician knows what is appropriate for someone in charge of the sick. A cowherd knows what is appropriate for calming cattle. In each case, the knowledge of appropriate speech belongs to the specialist, not the rhapsode. So, what domain remains? Ion's answer is desperate and revealing. The rhapsode knows what a general should say to his soldiers. The rhapsode's skill, he claims, is the same as the general's skill. Because he is the best rhapsode, he is also the best general. Here Socrates pounces, and he names Ion with a word that contains an entire theory of performance. He calls him Protean. Proteus was the shape-shifting sea god of Greek mythology, the old man of the sea who could transform into any beast, any element, any form to escape capture. The metaphor is devastatingly precise. The rhapsode's art consists precisely in becoming other people on stage. Ion is Protean because he becomes Hector, then Achilles, then Priam, then Andromache, shifting his shape with each new passage. He is not one person. He is whoever Homer asks him to be. But shape-shifting is not knowledge. To become another is not to understand another. The protean metaphor thus encapsulates the entire critique of mimetic identification that Plato will expand in the Republic. The actor who weeps as Priam does not weep as himself. He weeps in borrowed grief. And when the performance ends, the grief evaporates because it was never his to possess. Socrates presses the generalship claim with his historical specificity. If Ion knows what a general should say, then he possesses the knowledge of generalship. Why then does he go about Greece as a rhapsode, crowned with wreaths, instead of serving as a general? The Greeks are constantly at war. They have great need for good generals. Ion's excuse that he is a foreigner from Ephesus crumbles immediately. Socrates cites examples of other foreigners whom the Athenians have chosen for military command. In the dramatic context of the dialogue, set before 412 BC, in the aftermath of the Sicilian catastrophe, this challenge is not abstract. Athens was actively recruiting foreign commanders. If Ion truly knew generalship, his refusal to serve was not merely a missed opportunity, but a failure of civic duty in a time of desperate need. The trap is complete. Ion cannot claim to possess the knowledge of generalship without being obliged to practice it. He cannot claim to possess rhapsodic knowledge because he has been unable to define any domain that belongs to the rhapsode alone. So we're going to talk more about the trap here. Because Socrates comes down to a split, let's say a split decision. Will it be unjust or divine? And this will be through sections 541E to 542B. Socrates offers Ion a choice, but it is a forced option between two incompatible self-understandings. If you have expertise in Homer, Socrates declares, and yet you refuse to demonstrate it by serving as a general, you are doing me an injustice. However, there is no injustice if you have no expertise, but are describing the manifold beauties of the poet possessed, as I said, by a divine portion from Homer, while knowing nothing. So decide whether you want us to regard you as an unjust man or as divine. Obviously, Ion chooses the divine. There is a big difference, Socrates. Indeed, the divine is regarded as better by far, and the dialogue ends. No aporia in the usual sense, but a decision. Yet the ending is saturated with irony. Ion believes he has escaped with his dignity intact, choosing the honorable title of divine inspiration over the dishonorable title of unjust man. But we, the reader, we recognize that he has confessed to being an empty vessel, a conduit for forces he cannot control or comprehend. The choice is not a liberation. It's a surrender. The rhapsode who entered the conversation demanding a royal golden wreath from the Homerids, the rhapsode who entered the conversation demanding a gold wreath from the Homerids exits it stripped of every rational claim, left with only the borrowed glory of the muse. And this is where we have Techne and Mania. The entire dialogue is driven by a single opposition that structures every moment and determines its ultimate meaning. The opposition between Techne and Mania. Techne in Plato has specific and rigorous characteristics. It is universal within its domain. The expert in one area can judge all instances within that area. It is teachable. Skills can be passed from master to student through rational explanation. It is grounded in knowledge of the subject matter itself, and the expert can give an account of what he does and why. By every one of these criteria, Ion fails to qualify. His expertise is limited to one poet, suggesting it is not universal. He cannot teach in any way that he can explain. He cannot give an account of what he knows that withstands Socratic questioning. And when his claims are tested against specific passages, they dissolve into the specialized knowledge of charioteers, physicians, prophets, and fishermen. Mania is the antithesis in every respect. It is not universal, but particular. The muse inspires this poet, not that one. It is not teachable. Tenichois composed one beautiful hymn and nothing else, proving that his inspiration was a gift, not a skill acquired through training. It is not rational. The inspired person is out of his mind, not in possession of his faculties. It is not grounded in knowledge of the subject matter, but in contact with the divine. Ion fits this description perfectly. His tears, his pounding heart, his standing hair, all signs of possession. His inability to speak about other poets, a sign of selective inspiration. His power over audiences, a sign that the divine force flows through him to others. The choice between Techne and Mania is thus a choice between two conceptions of human excellence. One makes an artist a knower, accountable to rational standards, capable of giving an account of his work. The other makes the artist a vessel, a conduit for forces beyond his control. Beautiful but irrational, powerful but not wise. Plato does not explicitly say which conception he prefers. He leaves Ion to choose, and Ion chooses the divine. But the dialogue itself, with its relentless questioning, its demand for definitions, its insistence on consistency, embodies the philosophical alternative. The Ion itself is an exercise in Techne, a demonstration of what happens to examine claims, to knowledge rationality. It does not refute inspiration. It cannot, since inspiration is by definition beyond rational refutation. But it shows what inspiration is not. It is not knowledge, not skill, not something that can be defended in rational discourse. The misprision, Plato's hermeneutic of suspicion. So misprision, this is the Harold Bloom terminology we talked about at the beginning. Plato has not merely argued in the Ion, he has staged a drama whose very form betrays his most intimate conviction about the soul's true freedom. The hermeneutic strategy reveals itself as an epistemological, theological lens that deciphers every human excellence by asking a single question. Can you give an account? If not, is your power your own or the gods? This is no neutral inquiry. It is Plato's first sustained act of interpretive suspension toward the cultural giant whose shadow still darkened philosophy's cradle. The dominant mode is theological, only to serve the epistemological. The text constructs meaning through the lens of divine possession, precisely so that the rational knowledge may emerge as the higher active path. Every symbol is pressed into this service. The Heraclean stone becomes the model of non-rational transmission within the epistemology. Its hidden meaning is dependence. Art does not originate. It receives and passes on. The symbolic architecture is no ornament. It is Plato's dramatic strategy for revealing his core convictions about reality and knowledge. The rhapsode who claims to know what is appropriate for a man to say, or for a woman, or for a general, is stripped passage by passage until only two exits remain. Socrates forces the choice with merciless clarity. In that single line where Ion chooses the divine as better by far, the worldview stands naked. Plato believes that genuine knowledge is active, teachable, universal, and answerable, while inspiration is passive, particular, and irrational. The pathos that drives the entire expression is Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence. The young philosopher who has just lost Socrates to the city's verdict must now answer why the greatest poet still moves Athens to tears. He does not deny Homer's power. He reinterprets it as a divine possession so that philosophy may claim the higher ground of rational account giving. The cultural giant of Homer must be humbled if the new discipline of philosophy is to stand. We must not mistake this humbling for mere polemic. Plato is not simply angry at Homer. He is diagnosing a condition of the soul that persists wherever performance replaces knowledge. And to understand the severity of the diagnosis, we must look more closely at the man asking the questions. Socrates was not merely a barefoot integrator. Socrates was not merely a barefoot interrogator in the agora. He was a soldier. He had served as a hoplite at Potidaea, where he saved the life of the young Alcibiades at Delium, where the Athenian line collapsed, and he alone, according to Plato's testimony in the Symposium, maintained his composure while others fled in panic. And at Amphipolis, in the brutal northern campaigns, the general Lacus, or Laches, however you want to pronounce that, the general Lacus praised his courage publicly, noting that if all Athenians had fought as Socrates did, the enemy would have erected no victory monuments. When Socrates sits across from Ion and raises the question of generalship, he speaks with the authority of a man who has stood in the phalanx, who has felt the shield against his arm, who has watched men die because of decisions made by leaders who did or did not know what they were doing. The question is not an abstract provocation. It is the veteran's disciplined fury, turned into dialectic. The city that sends men like Socrates into battle is the same city that crowns men like Ion for reciting Homer. Something is catastrophically wrong. And what of the man being dismantled? Ion is, to put it plainly, a hollow man. He has allowed his identity to be entirely constituted by his performance. He is nothing apart from Homer, and he does not know Homer. He is a mirror reflecting a light whose source he has never seen. The audience weeps, and he weeps, but no one in the chain can say why. Transmission without understanding, passion without account, beauty without truth. This is Ion's condition, and Socrates forces him to inhabit it fully. When Socrates suggests that if Ion truly possessed the techne of a general, he could lead the Athenian army, Ion does not deny the absurdity. He sidesteps it. In a city where a rhapsode can plausibly be imagined as a general, the categories that should hold public life together, who knows what, who can do what, who deserves authority, they have dissolved. Athens has lost the capacity to distinguish performance from competence, emotional power from practical wisdom. Socrates is doing three things at once, and we must distinguish them. First, he exposes Ion himself, the individual man, vain and empty, who has built a career on a skill he cannot explain. Stripped of his golden crown, the rhapsode is revealed as nothing more than a link in a chain of transmission, a medium rather than a mind. Second, he exposes the institution Ion represents. Rhapsody is not a techne. It is a form of possession. The entire cultural apparatus that places Homer at the center of Greek education, the festivals, the prizes, the prestige, It rests upon a category error. The city has mistaken emotional transport for understanding. It's like the beautiful lie for the difficult truth. Third, and most dangerously, Socrates exposes the city itself. Athens is so captive to rhetoric and spectacle that a man like Ion can be celebrated as a teacher. Socrates holds up a mirror to the Athenian polis and forces it to see its own decadence, the hollow man in the city's own reflection. Yet Socrates does not simply dismiss the muse. The divine, as he insists, and as Ion eagerly accepts, is better by far than injustice. What Socrates preserves in the notion of thea mora is the recognition that some excellences really do exceed rational accounting. The poet may not know what he is doing, but the beauty of what he produces is real. The audience may not understand why they weep, but the tears are real. Socrates does not deny the power of poetry. He reclassifies it. Divine, not knowledgeable. Beautiful, not true. Inspiring, not instructive. This is why he is so dangerous to Ion. If he simply called him a fraud, Ion could fight back. But Socrates offers him a choice between two identities, both of which destroy him. Either Ion possesses a techne, in which case he must give an account, which he cannot do, or he is divinely possessed, and in which case he is not an expert, but a vessel, not an authority, but a conduit. Ion chooses divinity, and in doing so, confesses his own irrelevance. The muse gets the credit, Ion gets the golden crown, bought at the price of his intellectual dignity. The same argument that saves the beauty of poetry destroys the authority of the poet. We must wonder at what we have uncovered. How is it that a dialogue of barely 20 pages, written 2.5 millennia ago, illuminates our own condition with such precision? We live in an age where every screen is a rhapsodic stage, where millions perform emotion they cannot account for, where the magnet chain of transmission has become the architecture of our daily lives. The influencer who weeps on camera, the commentator whose authority rests on passion rather than expertise, the viral performance that moves millions without anyone being able to say why. These are Ion's heirs, multiplied by technology, but diminished in craft. And Homer is no longer Homer. The shadows on the wall are now shadows of shadows. The Ion is not merely a critique of Rhapsody. It is a diagnosis of permanent human temptation. And the fact that we can read it today and see ourselves in it, not as quaint historical observers, but as participants in the same chain, this suggests that Plato was mapping a structure of the soul that recurs wherever logos is overwhelmed by pathos, wherever accountability dissolves into spectacle. Plato had to have known exactly what he was doing. The dialogues are so carefully constructed, ironies are precisely layered. When we think of how long ago these texts were written, it can give us this feeling of nostalgic simplicity. Like, what could these Stone Era guys in robes actually really know about anything? For us to imagine that he stumbled onto these insights by accident is such a strange, but I guess an attractive way to think. But I tell you, I tell you it's not true. It can't be true. The ion is a machine. It's a machine designed to do something to its reader, to make us feel the gap between what we claim to know and what we can defend, to make us suspicious of our own tears, to force us to choose between the comfort of divine inspiration and the hard demand of giving an account. It is not a fount of authoritative wisdom, but an invitation to dialectical engagement. We have set the groundwork here. We have learned what Techne means, the skill of the mind, the craft that can be taught, the knowledge that can give and receive an account. And we have seen what it is not, the illusion of the Platonic mania, the appearance of knowledge without its substance, the beautiful performance that evaporates under questioning. We have watched the Socratic method at work, and we have felt how jarring it must be for the person living in illusion to have the veil torn away, to discover that the form visible to the world was never more than a painted screen. This has been Ion. It has been such a pleasure to read through this book with you, think through this book with you. And next will be episode 3. In episode 3, we're going to walk together into the bustling agora. I encourage you to throw that word into Google, like the agora of Athens. It was a very unique thing in this, in the ancient world. It's, I guess it was like an international marketplace where the boats would dock and people would trade their things, and it must have had a life to its own down there. But in episode 3, Socrates will encounter a man named Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is not a rhapsode. He is a self-proclaimed expert in piety, so certain of his knowledge that he is prosecuting his own father for murder. The dialogue that unfolds there will take our investigation deeper. If the Ion showed us what it means to lack Techne while claiming it, the Euthyphro will show us what it means to claim moral knowledge without having examined its foundations. The question, what is piety? This will prove as elusive as the question of what the rhapsode knows, and the stakes, as we shall see, are infinitely higher. Even though we're done with Ion for now, the things inside of Ion itself, the concepts and the arguments, they live throughout the Platonic dialogues. They still live with us now here today. The story of Plato's agon, like his struggle, his journey, the journey of the struggle with poetry it's far from over. The Republic still lies ahead, where the poets will be banished from the just city, and the Phaedrus, where divine madness will be welcomed back as philosophy's ally. So, the ring that we have placed in your hands today, the choice between the accountable life and the beautiful mystery, will remain suspended through all of it. For now, let us sit with the discomfort Socrates has created. Ion has chosen the divine, and perhaps he was right to do so. Perhaps some excellencies must remain beyond the reach of Logos if beauty is to survive. But the dialogue that records his choice is itself a work of merciless Techne, and it forces us to see the cost. Philosophy can name the chain, even if it cannot break it, and naming it, as we have seen in Ion, is already a kind of liberation. So until next time, remember, don't let anybody drink your milkshake.